Greetings music fans and welcome to PC's Vinyl Odyssey. This month I'm talking about the band Focus and I'm going to compare their 1973 live album to other live albums of the era. So without further ado, cue the titles. This month I'm going to be talking about the 1973 live Focus album, At the Rainbow, and I'll compare this album to a couple of other albums of the same era. I'm going to grade each album on audio and performance, and I'll mark them both out of 10. So before I begin, here's a brief history of the band, Focus. Focus was formed in mid-1969 by keyboardist, vocalist and flautist Thijs van Leer, who recruited bass guitarist Martin Dresden and drummer Hans Clover after he met them at sessions for a jazz and poetry radio program in Hilversum, the Netherlands. The band were initially known as Thijs van Leer and the Rebaptized, but by November 1969 they had changed their name to Focus and added guitarist Jan Ackerman to the lineup. By 1973, Focus had recorded 3 studio albums. Their most recent album, Focus 3, had considerable success around the world. It climbed to number 6 in the UK charts and number 35 in the US. A 4th studio album had been attempted in May 1973 and several songs recorded. However, internal issues in the band between Ackerman and Van Leer resulted in these songs not being released till years later. The album was scrapped, and so the record company Drawn Live Tapes also recorded in May for the band's next release.
I've travelled a huge distance today. I'm standing outside the location of the former Rainbow Theatre. I'm in the Finsbury Park area of London, and it's a staggering 10 minutes walk from my house. The building was originally known as the Finsbury Park Astoria Cinema and opened in 1930. The cinema gradually transitioned into a music venue over the years and was named the Rainbow Theatre in 1971. It closed its doors in 1982, and ever since 1988, it's been a church.
The Rainbow Theatre was a favourite venue for all the major rock bands of the 1970s. Deep Purple were inducted into the Guinness Book of Records for being the world's loudest band at a concert in 1974. Yes filmed their concerts in December 72 for theatrical release as Yes Songs in 1975. Iron Maiden recorded their first music video, Women in Uniform, in 1980. Focus at the Rainbow was recorded May 5th, 1973 and released in October of the same year. In the UK, it climbed to number 23 in the album charts. The lineup for this album was Thijs van Leer, vocal, organ, flute, Jan Ackerman, guitar, Bert Rauter, vocal and bass guitar, and Pierre van der Linden, drums. So how would I grade this record? Well, initially for performance, I gave it 7 out of 10. But I decided to give it an extra point and give it 8 out of 10 for Thijs van Leer's incredible yodeling on the track Hocus Pocus. My only criticism is track 2, Answers, Questions, Questions, Answers. The jam on this track just meanders a bit too long for my liking. Sonically, this record sounds great, and I'd give it 8.5 out of 10 for sound. It was recorded on the Pi mobile unit. The Rainbow Theatre had 3,040 seats, and I think the sound benefits on this record for a smaller setting as opposed to a huge stadium sound. This is the first UK release on the Polydor label. It was mixed at Air Studios and cut by Phonodisc Limited. There is a variation of the first UK release pressed in the US at Sterling Sound. I'm a big fan of this gatefold sleeve. The art direction was by Ian Murray and the illustrations were by Ian Beck. I'm now going to compare At the Rainbow to 2 other classic albums released during the same period, starting with an album released at the end of 1972. Deep Purple's Made in Japan was taken from recordings at Festival Hall, Osaka, and Budokan, Tokyo. These performances were from August 1972. The album was later released in December of the same year. It made number 16 in the UK charts and number 6 in the US. Surprisingly, the band didn't consider this an important album, apart from John Lord, who listed this as one of his favourite Deep Purple albums. Sonically, it sounds great, and claims to have no studio overdubs, unlike a certain Regal band of the 70s. For audio, I grade this 9 out of 10, and you want to look for an early UK pressing cut by George Porky Peckham. So for performance, I grade this 8 out of 10. Apart from my minor criticism of the long jams on the album, I'd still say this is one of the finest live albums of all time, and the band at their creative peak.
Now, it's been unfairly and inaccurately written many times over the years that a majority of the progressive rock bands had long extended solos and jams on their albums and live sets. In fact, it was rare for bands like Yes and Genesis to have improvised solos. The instrumental passages were contained as part of the composition and were rarely extended even at a live setting. The major culprits were actually the hard rock bands, and most notably Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin. Do we really need a 29-minute version of Dazed and Confused on The Song Remains the Same? The sections of this track where the band play are magical, but several minutes of Jimmy Page playing unaccompanied guitar with a violin bow are far from magical. Deep Purple's Made in Japan also suffers from similar issues. Space Truckin' is 90 minutes long, and again, when the whole band play, it's an incredible performance. But I'm not sure the instrumental jam warrants several minutes. As you can see, this is a double album release on the band's own label, Purple Records. I'd recommend you look for an early UK pressing of this album cut by George Peckham. Etched in the dead wax is either Porky or Paco, depending on which side you look on. Now, there are many variations of this release, so it's hard to identify. The very first UK pressing was manufactured by Gramophone Co. Limited, and if you see EMI written here, you have a later pressing. Made in Japan was also in brackets on the very, very first pressing, but this is a CBS contract pressing from 1972, but it's also still mastered by George Peckham. Later pressings also omit the album title here on the record label.
This album was originally released in a gatefold sleeve. It's a really nice package, and the cover art was actually designed by bassist Roger Glover. There's also a Canadian single sleeve pressing of this album from 1973. You could buy this album for £3.25 in 1972. Yes released their gargantuan triple live album Yes Songs in May 1973. The tracks were taken from various performances in the US, Canada and the UK, all recorded between February and December 1972. The lineup for this album was John Anderson vocals, Chris Squire bass, Steve Howe guitar, Rick Wayman keyboards, and Alan White drums. Bill Bruford is featured on drums on 3 tracks on this album: Perpetual Change, Long Distance Runaround, and The Fish, but departed the band in summer '72. This album includes tracks recorded at the Rainbow Theatre in London. Close to the Edge and Starship Trooper were taken from performances in December '72. And just to confuse your ear further, Rick Wakeman's keyboard solo, track 2 on disc 2, is taken from takes from 2 different venues. The first 2/3 are from November 15th at Knoxville Civic Coliseum in Knoxville, Tennessee, and the final third is from November 20th at the Nassau Coliseum in Uniondale, New York. It's fascinating to hear how Yes's studio creations come across in a live setting. Tracks such as Heart of the Sunrise, Roundabout, and You and I, and their selections they perform from the Yes album come across very strongly. Close to the Edge suffers from limitations of the technology of the period. This piece was very much conceived in the studio, and the lack of pipe organ and various studio effects leave me slightly unsatisfied. Having said that, I still can't fault their performance. Each band member is represented in a solo spot, and unlike Made in Japan, these are mostly composition-driven short interludes. So for performance, originally I was going to grade this 9 out of 10, but I decided to give it 8 out of 10 for Bill Bruford's drum solo on Perpetual Change. Now don't get me wrong, I'm a big Bill Bruford fan, but this solo really doesn't work for me. A fair amount of criticism has been directed at this album sonically over the years. Producer and engineer Eddie Offord travelled with the band as the band's live sound engineer. Offord was in charge of the band's sound on stage, whilst Jeff Haslam operated their recording equipment. My main criticism of the sound is the vocals are slightly distant on a couple of tracks.
Yes Songs was mixed at Advision Studios, and this pressing was mastered by George Piros, as indicated by GP in the Dead Wax. The vinyl itself was pressed at Preswell Records in New Jersey, as indicated by a PR in the Dead Wax. The record was released on Atlantic Records, and the first pressings have an 1841 Broadway, New York address here. If you have a 75 Rockefeller Plaza address, then you have a later pressing. Originally I owned a German pressing of this album which sounded muddy. However, having now heard a first UK and a first US press, I now disagree with the comments that this is a bad sounding album.
Yes Songs is a tricky album to grade sonically because each of the different venues has its own sound, some better than others. But I don't think it's a bad sounding album, so I'm going to give this 7.5 out of 10.
Roger Dean was responsible for the impressive artwork for Yes Songs. His brother Martin was responsible for the layout and photography. If you look closely at this painting entitled Pathways, you can see faint paw prints disguised as clouds. Roger Dean's cat apparently walked over the canvas while still wet. The album comes with custom inner sleeves and a great colour booklet.
So, is it easy to find good copies of these albums? For the Focus at the Rainbow, you should be able to get this for around £15 to £20 near Mint online. Now, for the Deep Purple and Yes, first pressings of these just seems to be overpriced online, so I suggest you look in record fairs and shops, and you should be able to get both of these for around £20, £25. So, it's that time of the show why I hand it over to this month's sponsor. Thank you, Jem the dog, this month's sponsor. Now, if someone said to me, I'm going to attack you with some fresh fruits unless you pick a favourite album out of these three, I'd have to say, well, do your worst with a pineapple. I just can't pick. All three of these albums are really incredible, and they capture the bands at the heights of their powers. And if I had to grade them, I'd grade them 10 out of 10 for enjoyment. It's been great fun making this video this month, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all again on another episode of BC's Vinyl Odyssey.